I can still hear the exact noise that envelope made when it slipped from my fingers and landed on the kitchen table. It wasn't dramatic or explosive, just a flat, papery thud. But it carried weight, the kind that settles in your stomach before your brain has time to process why. It felt heavier than paper should feel, like it already understood it was about to rearrange my day, maybe even my entire year. Standing across from me was a woman I'd only ever observed from a polite distance. Impeccably dressed, perfect posture, the kind of smile that belongs in promotional photos for upscale neighborhoods. Marion Holt, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. She held her clipboard the way a judge holds a gavel, not for discussion, but for declaration. And I actually laughed, because the very first line of the notice claimed that my flagpole was now classified as a visual nuisance. A visual nuisance. Like it was some abstract sculpture at a pretentious gallery, not a 60-year-old steel pole rooted in the same square of earth long, before the subdivision even had paved sidewalks. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, dragging my hand through my hair. "That pole's been there longer than both of us put together." She didn't blink. Her smile tightened instead. It was the kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. The kind that quietly says, "This decision's already been made. You're just late to the realization," in a calm, almost rehearsed tone, the same one someone might use explaining a parking ticket. She informed me that the HOA board had reviewed my property. Complaints had been submitted. Community standards evolve. Neighborhoods mature. Appearances matter. And under the updated guidelines, my flagpole was now officially out of compliance. I had 30 days to remove it or face a fine slightly over $5,000. She said it like $5,000 was pocket lint, like she wasn't casually demanding I erase something that had stood in my yard for generations. I looked past her through the window. The flag was out there, edges wore in colors softened by time, swaying gently in the morning breeze. And all I could picture was my grandfather decades ago, standing in that same yard with a length of string and a hammer, measuring the spot by eye and instinct. I could almost hear him telling me that some things don't ask permission to exist. They just do. That pole isn't decoration. I told her. It's not landscaping. It's history. It's legacy. It was installed legally before Oak Ridge Estates ever decided beige was a personality. That's when her voice shifted, just slightly. A tiny crack in the polished exterior. "That's not relevant," she said. The dismissal in her tone, sharp, impatient, tightened something in my chest, because suddenly this wasn't about steel and fabric. It was about context. And when someone decides context doesn't matter, they usually have a reason. She stepped closer to the window, folded her arms, and studied the pole as if it personally insulted her. "The HOA," she reminded me, "holds final authority. It always has. It always will." And that was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about neighbor complaints. No one had approached me. No one had voiced concerns. This wasn't about safety, sight lines, or property values. This was about control. Pure and simple. And Marion Holt didn't seem like the kind of person who tolerated reminders that there were things beyond her reach. When she left, her heels struck the pavement of my walkway in sharp, deliberate clicks, like punctuation at the end of an argument she believed was finished. I stood there longer than I'd care to admit, staring at the pole and replaying her phrases in my head. Visual nuisance, out of compliance, final authority, anger mixed with disbelief, creeping in slowly. A part of me kept expecting logic to tap me on the shoulder and say, "Relax, this is obviously a misunderstanding." It never did. 2 days later, another envelope arrived. Thicker, heavier, certified mail, the kind you don't open casually. Inside was formal language dressed up in legal confidence. Bold figures, escalating penalties, and a cheerful reminder that failure to comply could result in further legal action, which is just a polite way of saying, we are absolutely not bluffing. That's when the neighborhood atmosphere shifted. Nothing obvious, nothing confrontational, just subtle changes. Conversations pausing when I walked by, people suddenly fascinated by their phones. Cal, from 3 houses down, caught me at the mailbox one afternoon, while pretending to sort through junk mail. He leaned closer and muttered that maybe I should just remove it, keep the peace. Marion, he warned, had a long memory and an even longer reach. It struck me then how quickly a community built on quiet streets and identical mailboxes could start to feel like a miniature dictatorship once you peeled back the surface. Sleep became a joke. Every night, I half dreamed about envelopes sliding under the door, fines multiplying like interest, my grandfather standing somewhere in the corner of my memory, shaking his head in quiet disappointment. Every morning before work, I'd pause by the pole. I'd run my hand along the cold steel and feel the pressure mounting. Because once you let someone decide which pieces of your history are acceptable, they rarely stop there. The real turning point came when I filed an appeal. Calm, respectful. I laid out installation dates, prior approvals, basic logic. I even tried to sound cooperative. The response arrived in under 24 hours. Appeal denied. No explanation. No dialogue. Just a number and a deadline. And that's when it became clear this had crossed into something else. Rules are one thing. But when someone won't even pretend to listen, that's not governance. That's domination. I started asking myself a question I hadn't expected. Not just how far Marion Holt was willing to push this, but why? People don't go this hard over nothing. And somehow, that flagpole had become the symbol she needed to break. Now, let me pause here for a moment, because this is where a lot of homeowners get tangled up, and where HOA authority feels far more intimidating than it actually is. On paper, bylaws are written with language that sounds absolute. Phrases like final authority and community standards are designed to shrink you a little. But legally speaking, those rules cannot override state law, prior approvals, or established property rights. No matter how confidently someone stands there clutching a clipboard, the strategy is largely psychological. Fast deadlines, mounting fines, social pressure, neighbors whispering instead of speaking up. Because intimidation works best when it feels like everyone else has already agreed. Marion wasn't simply applying the rules. She was manufacturing urgency, compressing the timeline, escalating the pressure, hoping I'd fold before I had the chance to ask the one question HOAs dread more than anything else. Where exactly does your authority stop? Here's the quiet reality most homeowners only discover when they're already cornered. Long-standing structures, especially ones installed legally before an HOA amended its rules, are often protected under what's called grandfathering. That means they're exempt from new aesthetic standards, no matter how inconvenient that exemption might be for a board hungry to assert control. It's an uncomfortable lesson. The HOA system doesn't reward fairness. It rewards obedience. The second you rush to smooth things over, apologize just to calm tensions, or comply to avoid conflict, you send a clear signal, and they learn precisely how far they can push you next time. Once I understood that the situation wasn't about a pole or a flag, but about pressure, leverage, and timing, something inside me shifted. Not calm, not exactly. More like sharpened focus. Anger flares up fast and burns out just as quickly. Clarity, though, clarity stays. So I stopped reacting. No more heated letters. No more defending myself to neighbors who were too uncomfortable to pick a side. No more waiting for Marion to rediscover reason. Instead, I began digging, quietly, deliberately, the way my grandfather approached every problem. Steady hands, observant eyes. Night after night, I sat at the dining table surrounded by printed HOA bylaws, county zoning documents, decades-old subdivision maps. I learned their vocabulary. Words designed to intimidate, variance, compliance, order, enforcement action. And the deeper I read, the more obvious it became. Oak Ridge Estates had authority, yes, but not the sweeping, retroactive, rewrite your past authority Marion was implying. They didn't have the power to erase history just because it didn't fit their updated palette. That's when I thought about the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. It was filled with boxes labeled old stuff, which really meant I hadn't yet decided what deserved to matter. But if this fight was rooted in the past, that's where the answer would be. One evening, I climbed the ladder. Dust hung thick in the air. Cardboard stacked like forgotten chapters of a book I hadn't finished reading. I opened box after box. Letters, photographs, medals wrapped in cloth. Pictures of my grandfather, younger than I ever knew him, standing proudly in that same yard. And then I found it. a worn manila folder tucked behind brittle notebooks, stamped with a county seal. So faded you had to tilt it toward the light to read it. Inside was a permit. Official, dated decades before Oak Ridge Estates even existed. It authorized the installation of a permanent flagpole. Approved, recorded, archived. It wasn't an opinion. It wasn't decorative preference. It was documentation. I sat there for a long time holding that paper. Relief washed over me first. Proof that I wasn't imagining things. Then came the anger, because either Marion hadn't bothered to look, or she had looked and decided to gamble that I wouldn't. The next morning, I called a housing attorney. Not someone flashy or theatrical. Just a straightforward woman named Ellen Brooks who spoke clearly and listened carefully. When I handed her the permit, she didn't grin or high-five me. She nodded once and said, "This changes everything," which in lawyer language means they miscalculated. Legally speaking, she explained, the HOA hadn't just overreached, they potentially exposed themselves. Harassment, selective enforcement, possible damages, especially if it could be shown that Marion knew about the permit and chose to proceed anyway. That's when the chess match truly began. Power like hers doesn't collapse when you confront it loudly. It weakens when it's documented. I didn't storm into the HOA office waving paperwork. I waited. I attended a board meeting, sat quietly in the back row, observed. I watched her posture, noted how her voice shifted when questioned, saw how quickly politeness dissolved into irritation the moment anyone pushed back. After the meeting, I caught her alone. I kept my tone casual, told her I was reconsidering my options, asked her what happened if I complied late. I watched her shoulders loosen, just slightly, the way people relax when they think they're winning. She explained that the fines would continue accumulating, that she would personally ensure enforcement remained aggressive, that the board relied entirely on her judgment. And then she added, almost smugly, that homeowners who challenged the HOA always lost. I asked, as evenly as I could, whether the board had reviewed historical permits. She laughed, actually laughed, said those old records didn't really matter anymore, that the HOA determines what's relevant now. And that was the moment, the precise second she shifted from arrogance into evidence. When Ellen listened to the recording later, she nearly spilled her coffee. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was clean, direct, a straight, unbroken line from assumed authority to admitted overreach. After that, the tone from the HOA changed. Their letters lost their confidence. Deadlines became vague. Marion's emails grew shorter and noticeably sharper. The digital equivalent of someone realizing the ground beneath them might not be stable after all. The hearing itself wasn't cinematic. No shouting, no dramatic gavel slams. Just a small room, an exhausted judge, and a stack of documents that told a story Marion couldn't rewrite. The permit, the timeline, the recording, the pattern of enforcement. Facts don't raise their voices. They just sit there and wait. When the decision finally came, it was almost underwhelming. The fines were dismissed. Enforcement was terminated. The HOA was ordered to cease further action. Just a few straightforward sentences, and years of bluster dissolved on the spot. Marion didn't look crushed. She looked shocked, like someone who had spent years believing she was untouchable, only to realize the armor she wore had never actually been there. It wasn't defeat written on her face. It was disbelief. As for me, I walked out of that building feeling lighter than I had in months. Not victorious. Not vindicated in some dramatic, cinematic way. Just relieved, because winning didn't feel like beating someone. It felt like inhaling fully for the first time in a long while. But the Rayall resolution didn't happen inside that courtroom. It unfolded back in the neighborhood. Quietly, gradually. People started asking questions. Not in whispers this time, but out loud. Cal stopped lowering his voice when we talked. A woman down the street thanked me one afternoon, admitting she'd been fined over the color of her mailbox 3 years earlier and had paid it without a fight. She said she hadn't thought she had another option. Marion missed one board meeting, then another. Eventually, the board announced a leadership review wrapped in the gentle language of rebuilding community trust. One evening, I stood in my yard watching the flag sway the way it always had, and it finally hit me. This had never been about metal or fabric. It was about who gets to decide what belongs, what stays, what goes, who you're allowed to be in the place you call home. The strange thing about winning something like this is that it doesn't feel like a movie. There's no applause swelling in the background, no neighbors lining the sidewalks, no triumphant soundtrack. It's quieter than that, and a little uncomfortable, because once the conflict fades, you're left staring at a bigger question. What now? That's where the real lesson hides. On paper, HOAs are meant to maintain shared spaces and mediate disputes, not to overpower individual homeowners. But the space between what they're supposed to be and what they sometimes become is often filled with one powerful ingredient: silence. Neighbors choosing comfort over principle. Boards mistaking apathy for agreement. People like Marion learning that if they apply enough pressure, most residents will fold. That's why stories like this repeat themselves in different neighborhoods with different names. Legally speaking, my case was extraordinary. There was no secret loophole, no miracle argument, just documentation, patience, and a refusal to accept because we said so as a complete answer. That's the piece people overlook. The law doesn't favor the loudest voice. It favors the clearest record, but only if someone is willing to create one. HOAs rely less on fines than they do on psychology. The suggestion that pushing back makes you difficult, selfish, disruptive, when in reality, it often means you're simply the first person in the room willing to ask where the boundary actually is. After everything's settled, neighbors approach me, not angry, not exactly grateful, just thoughtful, curious. They ask what they might have done differently in their own situations. Mailbox violations, landscaping citations, fees that never quite added up. And I kept hearing the same sentence. I didn't think I had a choice. That belief is more dangerous than any bylaw. The takeaway isn't that you should wage war against your HOA or turn every disagreement into a crusade. It's this: power thrives on vagueness and urgency. When you slow things down, ask for documentation, request clarification, and refuse to rush, the balance shifts. Not because you're aggressive, because you're deliberate. I also learned something harder to admit. People aren't silent because they agree. They're silent because they're exhausted, tired from work, tired from life, tired of the idea that one small disagreement could spiral into weeks of stress they don't have the energy for. And organizations that drift toward control learn how to weaponize that exhaustion. What broke the pattern in my neighborhood wasn't the judge's ruling. It was visibility. The simple reality that someone stood up and didn't get destroyed, didn't disappear, didn't become the cautionary tale. After that, the bylaws didn't magically transform overnight, but the atmosphere did. Conversations grew louder. Questions became sharper. Meetings stretched longer. Authority was asked to explain itself again, and that's almost always a healthy sign. I still pass that flagpole every morning. It doesn't feel like a trophy. It feels steady, grounding, a reminder that homes aren't just structures. They're stories layered over time. And when someone tells you your story is inconvenient, it's worth asking who gained from rewriting it. So I'll leave you with this. Not advice, not a checklist. Just something to think about. If someone in your community is enforcing rules without transparency, if deadlines feel rushed, if consequences seem exaggerated, if everyone senses something's off, but no one wants to say it aloud, that's usually the moment that matters most. I'm genuinely curious where you stand. Would you have paid the fine to keep things quiet? Or would you have pushed back, even if it meant standing alone for a while? Have you ever watched authority overstep because no one challenged it, or been the one who decided it wasn't worth the trouble? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, because stories like this don't belong to one neighborhood or one flagpole. They belong to anyone who's ever had to decide whether keeping the peace was worth the price.